For everyone who's on the call that isn't familiar with me, I'm Chris Vaccaro. I run the graduate program here in journalism at Hofstra. There's a bunch of my students on here from the class that I normally teach right now on Tuesdays, which deals with sports media culture, and a little bit of public relations, a little bit of journalism, and a little bit about sociology in many ways. And then there's a bunch of other invited students that are probably prospective students to the graduate program. So, we could talk about that later on, but definitely this is a taste of what we do as part of the graduate program, bringing in very successful and, knowledgeable guests in their own right. And then we have some folks from the university on, the assistant dean of the School of Comm will be on later. And so we'll just have a great conversation about sports culture, society, and media. But I want to make sure I know all the panelists. Hopefully you've heard of all the panelists in some way, shape, or form, but I want to, introduce them and make sure that you all hear who they are and their connections to the school. And we'll start with George. I mean, when I was the sports editor of the Hofstra Chronicle, I can't believe it's about 18 years ago already. We used to look at this name of George in the paper in the New York Times and go, we got to be like this guy. We want to be the next George Vesey. And it's pretty difficult to do that considering you've had a remarkable career, but I've looked up to you for many, many years. And you have a great story to tell of how you've succeeded in journalism, and you went to Hofstra. So that's the best part. But so, let's hear from you.
Well, I did go to Hofstra, never took a journalism class because I was lucky enough that Newsday was right on the other side of where the campus is, the North Campus is. And I started working at Newsday as a freshman. So I always figured, why spend money on journalism classes? Don't tell this to your teachers. But I figured, why spend money on journalism classes when I was working with the cream of the crop, the Newsday sports department. So I had a great break in there. And of course, I did work for the Hofstra Chronicle and other things, but I had a great education at Hofstra, met my wife there, which is the best thing that could come out of it, and just had a great time. So I owe a lot to Hofstra, and I wish you all the best in your career too.
Awesome. So from one Hofstra alum to another, Marcus Vanderberg, he was at Hofstra about the same time I was as a student. He's had a great career in sports media on the digital side, especially with Yahoo, and he's transferred over to ESPN in recent years. And tell us about what you do and what Hofstra meant to you.
Yeah, first off, George, you're a legend. Salute. Nice to be on a panel with you. Very familiar with your work. So my name is Marcus Vanderberg. I was one of the rare Los Angeles people to make their way to Hofstra. I was a transfer student, and I was very familiar with the area. I had family in Mount Vernon, so New York was not new to me. But graduated from Hofstra in 2008, studied print journalism. But when I was finishing up in school, Twitter became a thing. More of the focus in the curriculum was focused on social media. So I was sort of right at the edge of that. As Chris mentioned, I currently work at ESPN as a senior NBA editor. I started at ESPN in July. Prior to that, I worked 9 years at Yahoo Sports, where I did NBA coverage for them. I did baseball, working with Jeff Passan and Tim Brown. And I started Yahoo as a programmer. So I came in the door actually updating the website. Prior to Yahoo, I've worked in digital essentially since college. I worked for BET, working on their digital side. I've worked for various websites, and back in my 20s, I was doing a lot more writing. So I was writing for a variety of outlets, but a lot of that came from my time at Hofstra. And unlike George, I did study journalism because for me, I figured it was sort of the easy way out, was to study the stuff I was passionate about. So I was a journalism major.
Awesome. And the only non-Hofstra alum, Wayne Randazzo, for all you Mets fans, obviously you're aware he's a voice of the Mets on WCBS, and he's from Chicago, and he's at a great rise to a job that many people envy. And Wayne, do you want to give a quick intro? He's muted. Oh, there he is.
Yes, Chris, how you doing?
Hey.
I did not go to Hofstra, and I'm not even from New York, but I do understand what George means about, the difference between journalism class and picking up things from the actual field. I did study broadcasting at North Central College, a tiny little school in suburban Chicago, Division III school. But, I learned 1/100th of what I needed to learn there, as opposed to when I interned at WGN or when I started working in the field. And I got my first job when I was 21 years old at the Illinois Radio Network. So that was really the education, was working in the field and being able to intern at places and to get an entry-level job at a young age. That's really when I started to put together the building blocks of what would become my career.
Awesome. And obviously tonight we're going to talk about that crossroads of societal issues in sports, and how to do that in an objective way, in a way of advocacy, in a way of editorialization. There's different methods of telling stories that help reflect all of the things happening in society. And between Marcus on the digital side, Wayne on the broadcast side, George from what he's experienced in print all these years, we definitely have a nice array of how these things have been handled. And I'm always curious of the older perspective from George, who has written and grew up and created a career in journalism way before anything with social media and digital existed. But yet, issues in society that touched in sports and on athletes, they were there. They were there in the 50s, 60s, 70s. What do you see as the difference of how those issues have been covered, if there are any differences? And what are your experiences in writing about societal issues, on the sports pages?
Well, these days, if I can put it that way, I don't think that people are looking at what is being done in print or on electronic media and saying, why are you guys raising these issues? They might say, oh, you go too far, or you're wrong about this, but it's understood that you will be stirring the pot on everything, whether it's the quarterback who kneels or anything else, that people will be watching, and they'll expect it of you. When we were doing it, and I always say we about Newsday, even though I left there in '68, because if you hear ball players talk, it's always we, and the we changes in the middle of a sentence. We did this and we did that, but it's two different we's from when he was traded or something. So we was Newsday, and it always will be. I had a great start there, and we were doing that stuff, I have to say, as early as anybody. Collectively, we had a live wire sports editor named Jack Mann, MANN, and he was a news reporter, and he came into the sports department, and he yanked a very parochial, local, bowling news and high school news, all of which were fine, and he made it into, you go out and cover this and ask hard questions, ask somebody, why this, why that, and so we pretty quickly got into, money, race, gender, things that we were doing back in 1960. We would drive people crazy by asking those questions. I have to say, to be blunt about it, no paper in New York was doing what we were doing. Maybe the New York Post came along around the same time. In the Philadelphia Daily News, we were like 3 papers. We were connected by the kinds of, and also they were afternoon papers. The New York Times didn't really start to stir the pot until Robert Lipsyte became a sports columnist around 1964. He was only about 26, 27, out of Columbia, and a real smart ass. And he really would go places. He'd go to the track and find why jockeys were badly paid and look at the conditions they had in living. That was his thing, those kinds of social issues. So it began to get pushed. It was the 60s. You've heard enough about the 60s to know that there was a lot of ferment. And I think that some sports writers and departments conducted themselves very well. One thing I'd like to add on this, Chris, is before I gave a very smart aleck response about not taking journalism classes. When I became a news reporter in 1970, I did 10 years in the real world, as we say, capital R, capital W. And I didn't know how to report stories. I didn't know how to get information. I didn't know what I could get, how to ask for it, what I was entitled to. I didn't know the basic things. So it would have been very nice if I had taken one journalism course or more in college and somebody said, go down to town hall and find out when the next meeting is or something, because I was way behind. And yet I was covering major national news things and trying to hide the fact that I didn't know what I was doing.
And Marcus, and by the way, anybody that has questions, we could keep this interactive and engaging. Just put a question in the chat, and I'll call on people throughout. So don't feel like you have to wait till the end. We, definitely can keep it lively like that. Marcus, you've grown up and your career has grown in this digital and social age where everything is magnified, where the issues seem like they've never mattered more, which again, I'm sure they matter just as much, except there's the microscope of social that really makes it huge every day. This weighs in, I'm sure, on your editorial decision-making, on your assignments with reporters. And when you say senior NBA editor, sure, it's not just about games. It's not just about stats and rebounds and buckets. It's a hell of a lot more. So I'm just so curious about what you do during your day-to-day, how you're monitoring these issues, how you work with reporters, and just go into sort of what you experience every day.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, when you mentioned senior NBA, a lot of the stories would be focused just on stuff on the court. But as you know, that's not, reality. Since I'll focus on my time at Yahoo for this example, since I just started at ESPN, but I was running NBA coverage during the bubble, and everything that came out of the bubble, when you think about the pandemic, and then you think about Jacob Blake and the Bucks deciding to protest, and just sort of the overall sort of tension that our country was going through in 2020. So a lot of our stories, honestly, were focused on angles and issues off the court. We were fortunate to have Chris Haynes, who was staffed the entire time in the bubble, but we also had Vinny Goodwill, who's a columnist, who was doing a lot of his columns, honestly, were more so focused on the social issues off the court. And for him personally, that was very mentally draining, because some of the topics he got into really hit home. There was one column in particular he wrote about his experience with the police and finding himself sort of on the wrong side of law enforcement. And that's a story he had never really talked about in public. So to sort of open up yourself like that to an audience in Yahoo that, to be blunt, can be very, very direct and very ugly at times in the comments in terms of some of the content they're digesting. So, that was a good example of 2020 of just like, yes, I'm covering NBA, and yes, I would, love to focus on, the Lakers or the Heat. But when you're talking about a league that's predominantly Black, it is hard to not escape sort of the reality of life and things that these players are passionate about.
And race is one thing, but even the health, like you talk about the bubble, COVID, it all matters. Even, stories are about attendance and when fans can go back in and what they can expect from the health and safety of their players. Even on a fantasy basketball perspective, like everything just is compounded by the moment. And so, yeah, 2021 is just crazy in a lot of ways. But then again, I don't know, 2020 was pretty out of this world.
It was pretty bad.
And Wayne has to talk for hours and hours on end. He has to fill the air. Luckily, he gets to do it with Howie Rose, a pro's pro who is a legend in his own right. But there's so much to talk about. Yet Wayne and Howie have to figure out what's the line of how much to talk about related to these societal issues. Where do you weave it in the middle of strikes and balls and home runs? How do you find that balance? What do you use as your barometer of storytelling versus sharing stuff from the outside world about what's going on around you?
Yeah, it's really dependent on a lot of things, right? I mean, if you go back and listen to baseball broadcasts from like the 1960s, those were quick games, 2-hour, 20-minute games, usually 2.5. And a lot of the broadcasts are just giving you ball one, strike one, ground ball, fly ball, whatever. They're not telling you much as far as stories are concerned, because they don't need to. The game's moving so quickly that it really has changed over the last 30 years of broadcasting baseball, that you really need to be a good storyteller. And I think, Vince Scully was first and foremost, and likely always will be in that regard, the best to ever do that part of it, as well as the actual play-by-play. But as far as mixing in societal issues and what's going on the field as compared to what's going on off, really just have to find your spots. If it's 2-1 in the bottom of the 8th inning and the bases are loaded, well, it's probably not a good time to talk about societal issues. That's probably a good time to focus on the game itself and what the next pitch is and what is about to happen in an important part of the game. Now, if it's the fourth inning and the game's taking a while and they're on their third or fourth pitching change already, that's a good time to start launching into different storylines. And if some of that has to do with off the field things, we'll bring that in too. Baseball isn't quite like the NBA when it comes to dealing with society and having a voice that matters as much as the basketball players take advantage of that and the football players do. The baseball players tend not to be out there as much. We did see more of that in 2020 and maybe less of it in 2021, but certainly Dominic Smith was a big part of it in 2020. And, Howie and I were certainly able to shine light on that and to be able to talk about what Dom was feeling and what he wanted his message to be. And, we're happy to mix that into the baseball game.
And George, the Sports of Our Times column, you're writing about literally the sports and how it's reflecting upon culture today. And you've done that for so many years, for decades. How did that column progress based on the stories, stories in culture, stories about things off the field? How often did you find yourself writing about that in the Times column?
As often as I could and as often as I should, I'd like to think, but I did want to give a change of pace. Sometimes you have to be at a ball game. Somebody hits a home run bottom of the ninth inning in a World Series game, you're writing about that. But other times things are going on, whether it's women wanting more participation in sports and soccer and other things, or African-American players standing up for what they want, even back in the early 80s, but that had been done before. I have to say, it wasn't like I was blazing any trails at the Times because of what Lipside had done in the 60s. And then Dave Anderson also, he took over and he was around. So I was following them. I didn't really have to blaze any trails. It was just being consistent and having my own point of view of finding the right people to talk to. I mean, you'd be happy when there was you'd call Harry Edwards out in California, or Jim Brown would show up at a press conference. And to me, it was like a blast from the past. It was like being back in the 60s again and hearing these guys say, we're going to close down Madison Square Garden if this track meet isn't integrated or whatever it was. I love to hear that stuff. And I would bring it up by the 80s, by the time I came back into sports from having been away for 10 years, covering, coal mines blowing up and assassinations of the president of Bermuda or elections, and now I was back in the sports world again. But it was too serious to not take it and give it a lot of respect. That you had to find things to write about. So you'd look for people who would talk about it, and looking for examples, and not to be afraid to criticize. For example, there's something that came up the other day, is something somebody wouldn't think about, but during the 1986 playoffs, the National League, in all its wisdom, had scheduled 2 Mets games on Yom Kippur. I'm not Jewish, but I thought that was a rather stupid thing to do. And so I wrote a column about, just out of the top of my head, nobody was asking me to do this. And I wrote a column, I said, there's going to be a biblical rain on the first night of Yom Kippur. And they're going to get rained out. If they're lucky, they'll have an ark to go away on. And wouldn't you know it, on that day, it poured like crazy. They canceled the game. And my satisfaction was to get in an elevator after the game had been called off. And there's Bart Giamatti, this pompous, Yaley academic, and now he's the president of the National League, and he's in the elevator and he looks at me, and I just laughed at him, just laughed, because it was funny. But that's the kind of thing you want it to be. You want it to be a pain in the neck to these guys breaking their balloon. I once said to Paul Tagliabue, who is the commissioner of the National Football League, and he was sitting in a press box with me before a football game when I am not a big football fan. And he said, what do you see your job? And I knew he was a bright guy. His brother worked for the Times. He said, what do you see your job? And I said, well, I'm like the little kid in a snowstorm, and my job is to make a snowball and knock the top hat off the rich guy. I said, that's you guys, that's the National Football League. And he looked at me, and I could see, guy's a big man. He was a star at Georgetown, and he's backing away from me because he thought this man is crazy. He had no idea that journalists like to embarrass the big pompous National Football League for doing something stupid, whatever it was that week. But that I felt, but other times I had so much freedom. I mean, I don't want to get too nostalgic with you all because there's no job like it left anymore. They have, sort of blown up the sports column. They have one really good guy, Kurt Streeter, out in Seattle. But, and don't quote me on any, this is all off the record, you understand. But
Yeah.
I had such a dream job where I really called the shots. I was put in there by the editor of the paper, Abe Rosenthal, the managing editor, Arthur Gelb, and I was a creature of them. They took me out of the newsroom, put me back into sports, and it wasn't like I could do anything I want, but I could certainly start to do anything I want. The subject matter was up to me. So one day it'd be a kid going hunting, one day it'd be a big ball game, one day it would be a racial or gender story, but it wasn't like I was looking to alternate them. It just was natural. I had so much fun for really 20 years, and I'm really sorry to see the column sort of fade into the background the way it is, except when Kurt writes one, and he's terrific.
And we hear George talking about all these big moments that he has to draw on. Marcus's career is still younger in nature, is still growing, and hopefully he'll have dozens and dozens of these types of stories. Before COVID, before the summer of struggle in 2020 with all the race issues that really just were at front and center, what were the bigger issues that you recall in the early part of your career related to society and culture, Marcus? What were things that you would look at BC before COVID?
BC before COVID. That's a good question. One that stands out was the Astro situation, which involved someone from the Astros front office essentially taunting the female reporters over having Robert Osuna on the roster. That was a situation which I think happened right before COVID, the year prior, and a situation where I think it led to sort of healthy discussions about baseball in general sort of being behind the times when it comes to women, and just the league, I think, not doing enough to punish players that were involved in domestic violence. DV in general, sadly, that has been something that's popped up a lot more over the last 5 years in all sports, honestly, and how the leagues have reacted to players finding themselves in allegations and guilty convictions. And I still think that the leagues don't know, honestly, how to handle most cases. You sort of see a wide range of punishments depending on the player and the allegation and the league. And I think that is, if you're thinking about, how to attract women to sort of support your leads, how do you get women to cover your leads, which is a whole separate issue that we can dive into about journalism. You need to really do a better job of trying to address these issues head on, because it's a poor reflection sort of all the leagues when you're not really properly punishing these players for being involved in stuff. So when I think about sort of big picture items, sort of domestic violence in general with players, one of the early stories I worked on the baseball side was Roldis Chapman, who Tim Browners at Passing broke a story at winter meetings one year about a DV case with Chapman, and that led to an eventual suspension. But that was sort of the start of it for me in baseball, was like, and since then, sadly, there have been multiple cases involving players in domestic violence with just the MLB. So that's a bit that stands out.
So from baseball to Wayne, I'm sure you get to mingle with a lot of players, even just in the course of travel, just being around the ballpark. I'm sure some of these stories that are all around us in the news every day, they may come up in conversation. They may come up where you have to ask them about their perspective on something. How often do you have that connection with players, coaches, support members of a team, front office folks? And, you have to be a journalist, gather info for the sake of the broadcast, but also be respectful of the relationship that you have with them. Well, you talk about those relationships and how you manufacture content for the broadcast.
Yeah, we're the team broadcast, so it's a totally different landscape for me and for our broadcast than it would be for someone like Marcus and the job that he has is totally different as far as gathering those stories and the way that he reports them. We had Jose Reyes a few years ago right after he came over from a domestic violence situation, and it was a long suspension at that time. I think it was the longest that MLB had handed out for someone who'd had a domestic violence accusation or charge thrown at him in the way that Jose Reyes had. And, Jose also was coming to the Mets after what had been a very successful time earlier in his career with the Mets. So he was somewhat of a beloved player, but also now he had this shadow cast across him because of the domestic violence. And there was a split fan base. Some of the fans were happy that Jose was back and was going to be able to help the team. And there was also a significant chunk of the fan base that really didn't want to give him that second chance, wish that he had gone somewhere else. So you have to ask around, and you have to get people's perspectives about why the organization thought that it was right to bring Jose back, and also what Jose wanted out of coming back and what he expected from the fans and what their reactions would be. And, it was pretty split at that time. So you have to be sensitive, of course, to what happened in Jose's personal life and how that came to light and why he was suspended. And also, you still have to exude excitement and enthusiasm over when he hits a home run. You can't just crush the guy all the time either as a team broadcaster because of what had happened in his personal life. And the Phillies just went through it with Odubel Herrera. That was another situation where Odubel had gotten himself in a bad situation and was out of the organization. And then, they needed a center fielder. They tried 5 or 6 different guys. And now Herrera comes back. He's the center fielder again. He has a good year. And again, it really splits the fan base off because, what's the right thing in that scenario? Do these guys deserve opportunities to play again? Do they deserve to come back to the organizations that they were in previously, or should they be cast off to go to a different team? We may never see Addison Russell in the major leagues again, but if he was capable of hitting 300 with 25 home runs, would he get another opportunity? And how would the fans and the broadcasters have to react to that? So it's a really tricky thing from a team broadcast standpoint to have to handle something like that. But it gets thrown out more and more. It seems like these days where we have to talk about things that wouldn't really have made broadcast air 20 or 30 years ago.
Now, do they have planning sessions or meetings pregame where they go over guidelines of what you should or should not touch on? Like how do they go about that with you so that everyone's sort of on the same page?
No, it's as far as our situation, and I can't speak for every team, obviously, but as far as the Mets situation goes, they were very hands off with us. I think the Wilpon family had a reputation, and Jeff may have had a reputation for being really micromanager and being hands on and sticking his nose in every facet of the organization. But he left us alone. He left us to say whatever we wanted about the team, whatever we wanted about certain players, and we never got any heat from anything we said on the broadcast. So that was nice to have. We've had an ownership change, and the first year under Steve Cohen was pretty much the same. Wasn't ever a problem with anything that we said on the radio broadcast, and we were never told to stay away from something or push something. It was pretty much just as free as it was under the Wilpon ownership. So that's, as a broadcaster, as great as it can be, because if you're having to worry about pleasing the ownership, then you're really not giving the fan base what they deserve in terms of a broadcast that's a little bit more honest than I would say most team broadcasts are. And
George, do you still write? Do you still find the urge to share your thoughts? Does the Times, get columns from you still? Like, how does your current writing go?
Well, I did for a while. I retired at the end of 2011. And then they kept me on as sort of a contract writer for 2 or 3 years, where I was still writing a column once in a while, which was fine. But look, I was over 70 by that time, and it was really time to, I just didn't want to work. And sometimes I'd get calls from people meaning well, hey, why don't you write about this or that? And I said, I don't know. So I'm fine with not working. I sort of miss writing the occasional piece or nostalgia piece that I really could handle. But I do have my own website, and I am now kicking and screaming. The last 10 years, I have had my own website, which I produce. I edit the pictures, I write the headlines, I edit myself, and I put it out there. It's georgevesey.com, and I write a lot about baseball. I write quite a bit about soccer, and I hate to say this, I don't write much about any other sport. I've sort of floated away from all the other sports to watch them or write about them. Why write about something when I don't have to, or I don't do it? But I write about my old Queen's neighbor Trump, or politics from my point of view. It's totally free. It's a website. So I do have fun with that. And I have old guys. That's all that's on my site. People in their 50s and 60s, and that's fine. I mean, how would I approach people younger if I weren't for the Times? Of course I would want to, but this basically is an opinion. So I'm having a lot of fun with that, writing about things I used to do, cover coal mining, cover Kentucky, when I lived down there for a few years. So I'm writing about that, and I have people writing in from Brazil, from Kentucky, from Israel, from France. It's a lot of fun, and that's how I keep typing.
So you talk about writing opinion, and if you're talking to a group of graduate students, whether they're even an undergrad, it's difficult to grow a voice and an opinion when everyone's like, hey, this is the who, what, where, when, why, and how. Be objective, ethical journalism. And so how did you grow your voice? How did you get that columnist feel?
Well, it was tough because we had editors who would, at Newsday, and then certainly when I went to the Times, who would slap you down. I had more freedom at Newsday from the very late 50s when I was covering high schools into 1968 when I left. They had a roving column called Dealer's Choice. And I remember writing a column in 1965. Warren Spahn was a pitcher and pitching coach, and he was very selfish, and he was ruining all the young kids and taking a start for himself. I wrote it, and I was 25 years old, and I wrote a column saying Warren Spahn is screwing the Mets. As bad as they are, he's making them worse. And they let him go a few days later. Now, it was brewing, and I'm sure it was sticking out, but I just said, somebody's got to write it, and I did. So I was glad to have that voice that Newsday let me do it. Going to the Times was a different thing. You couldn't suggest things. Even if you saw them, you had to say it from somebody else. There was no sense of I was there, whether it was in sports. I mean, if you saw a home run, you say, you don't have to prove it. But as a news reporter, if I would say something about coal mining, or they'd say, well, cite an expert. And I said, well, I don't need to be an expert. I know you can't mine coal off a mountaintop if it's more than 14-degree slope, because that's where they rule. And they wanted you to prove everything. These days, reporters for the Times are using first person. I was there, I saw this, and it's encouraged. In a way, the blood is really flowing better to have reporters who are out. And they hire. My son is a 50-year-old copy editor at the Times. He's the last person sometimes at night to touch the copy for the print paper before it goes into print. So he's there, and he said, Dad, you wouldn't believe how good these young people are, how smart they are, but everybody wants to be a columnist. They want to have their opinion every time. And sometimes you just have to separate it. They still have some rules, but it's so much easier now for reporters to talk about what they do, how they do it, how they feel.
Awesome. What does an editor at ESPN do, Marcus? Talk about, like, how do you spend your day? Is it assignments? Is it working with reporters? Is it planning rundowns of what goes on ESPN.com? Do you have any connection to the editorial decisions on TV or ESPN radio? Give these students insight into, what goes on in your day to day.
Yeah. So the beauty of working at an operation like ESPN is there are a lot of resources. So my day-to-day is a lot different here than it was at Yahoo Sports. At Yahoo, it was a lot more sort of ripping and running and trying to keep my head above water, and a lot more content that we were sort of going through here at ESPN, because it's such a big operation. There's a lot more time spent on sort of thinking about best placement for stories and strategy and what they made sense for a story. And because we are not on the NBA side, not producing, we usually produce with the season starting, maybe 2 stories a day, 2 original stories. And that frees up the editors to really work with reporters in terms of, what kind of long-term, short-term, short-range stories that we can be targeting. So a lot of my time these days spent talking to reporters. They love to call and text, and so that is a big portion of the day. The other portion of that day would be sort of collaborating with other editors, just in terms of whether it is budget planning or helping them with stories that might be coming out this week. And then since I've been here, part of my time has been focused on D&I efforts as well. That was something that is passionate to me, something I did at Yahoo, and something I've been fortunate to work on here. So, for example, we in October, we did a bunch of career fairs virtually that I set up. Unfortunately, we did not do Hofstra. Don't worry, I got you at some point. So we did Texas, Missouri, and Howard University, with the idea of getting the word out about our internship program, which rolls around the summer, and also just trying to identify young talent that we can sort of keep an eye on. So when they graduate and they're out of school, that we can sort of have a better feel for. So, I mean, that's sort of the main sort of gist of what a day is. I will warn you that once you sort of get to a certain company or a certain level, that you're not expected to work 24/7, but obviously if news dictates your work schedule. So I do have Saturday and Sunday off in theory, but let's say, I oversee the Lakers writer, for example. Let's say if David Mitterman has a story that, LeBron is out for the season. Yeah. And that drops on a Saturday. I'm working that Saturday. So I think that's something that I hope college kids are aware of too, once you graduate and get out to the real world, that this idea of working 40 hours a week, like, that is great in theory. And I'm all for work-life balance, but just be prepared that you will probably be you need to be flexible when it comes to your work, because there'll be situations where, especially working in sports, that, my boss sent out a note earlier today about the Christmas, Thanksgiving, and New Year's holidays in terms of work. Like, on the NBA side, that comes with the job. So that's something just to be aware of.
Yeah, no, great point. I mean, it's, the idea of sacrificing time, which you may not predict because of news, that's life in news. You have to get the story right. You have to make sure it's, now in this case, in our society, it's publish it in every platform possible and make sure it's told on streaming, on .com, on app, on, television. So now, how many people are you overseeing? How many people are you editing? You mentioned the Lakers beat writer. Do you deal with photographers as well to help with assigning for capturing media?
So I oversee 9 people in general. That includes some of my direct writers, direct editors, and then my editors, reporters as well. When it comes to collaboration, not photographer level, definitely on the TV side. So I do work on the TV side and trying to help coordinate contemporary pieces that will go with our stories. For example, with a writer who has a story that is scheduled to come out next week that TV wants to pair and do a video essay with. So my job ideally is to put my people in the best position to succeed. So if that means working with the TV side to ensure that they're clear on when a story is running so that they can also be prepared on their end. As I mentioned earlier, the company's so big that there's just so many layers to it that I'm not sort of directly working hands-on with certain parts of the company. There's a lot of stuff that the writers do it directly, which is great for them. A lot of times they are, filing news stories that goes to a whole separate team than myself. So if for example, last night we had Steph Curry who dropped 50 points in a game, our Warriors writer was there he files that story straight to the news desk, not to the NBA team. So that is the beauty of having such a big team, is that there's so many different layers that you sort of have help with, but also that means you need to be communicating with everyone to make sure that everyone's on the same page. And it's been tricky because, as you can see, I'm not in the office. Offices are still technically closed. And, even if the offices are open, like I'm not Bristol based, I'm Los Angeles, with people everywhere. So that, that requires you to use Slack or to pick the phone or to text and to make sure that people are up to speed.
You mentioned D&I, diversity and inclusion. I did want to talk about that. And you mentioned it from the hiring perspective, of course, trying to make sure the personnel that you bring in is balanced and fair. From an editorial perspective, it's also front and center to make sure that, again, things are balanced, that even just having the perspective of diversity. And when people hear diversity, it doesn't just mean Black or female. It means, George mentioned a story about Yom Kippur. It means getting the perspective of a Jewish person. It means Hispanic in the case of Hispanic Heritage Month and how we tell those stories. It means Italian American, and that's a specific perspective on what that means for stories about that culture. So how much, I feel like we've come a long way in a short period of time because it's so important more than ever. And even when I say that, I'm like, well, it was always important, but you know what I mean? It's really under the microscope, and companies are making the effort to have professional development to teach people this is the process of how to think about others, respect others. But in journalism, it's not just about respecting your peers and your colleagues, it's respecting the story and the audience and their perspective too. So what type of progress, if any, have you seen at ESPN? How much have you been a voice for that change? And have you noticed steps in actual conversations you've had where people are like really taking to heart how to do these stories to reflect the real nature of society?
Yeah. So I'll combine sort of both my time at Yahoo and ESPN. So when I started Yahoo in 2012, the term diversity and inclusion was not a thing. Let's just be real. So when I started, I mentioned, probably after my first couple years, I had mentioned the idea of doing sort of content around Black History Month. And I don't want to say I was discouraged by others to not sort of raise it up, but I definitely was not encouraged, and it definitely did not get off the ground. So to go from having sort of zero Black history presence on the site at Yahoo, and probably frankly most sites in 2014, to now where last year, in 2020, we had all these sort of different sort of subcommittees and groups internally within Yahoo that were focused just on D&I. And I was able to do a Black History Month sort of package in February. And I was able to do a sort of a series called Privilege of Play that won an APSC award that was focused on sort of the roadblocks that minorities students face getting into athletics. Like, these are projects that were never sort of, I think, been approved when I started Yahoo, to be honest. So just in those 9 years, like, we've made a lot of progress in terms of just being open to the idea of telling stories from a different perspective. I think D&I, it's sort of twofold, right? It's, you should be telling stories that represent everyone. And also the element of sort of hiring, making sure the right people are in the room and you're having the right decision makers. And that has also improved as well. The industry as a whole is still not perfect. It's still, especially in sports, there's still a lot of work to be done. Taking it to ESPN for a second. So since I've been here in July, like, I've definitely seen a lot more hires that have been diverse. They are definitely something that it's top of mind for them. They're working to try to improve sort of the demographics here in general. And they're also like, I did not want to come to the company and sort of point my finger at ESPN for not doing better without actually stepping up to do the work, right? There's no good in saying this is an issue, and then when the issue is presented to you, sort of backing away from it. So I told them, like, from day one, like, look, use me as a resource. Like, I am very connected with NABJ, and like, please lean on me to help with your situation. And they've been, willing to lean on me for that. So I think definitely there's still work to be done, but I think that we're sort of heading in the right direction.
Good to hear. Yeah, I mean, listen, it's I think every conversation in a company that cares is happening. It's a matter of like making sure that everybody buys in, and even if it's over time, change will happen. And hell, it's a lot of content ideas, right? I mean, that's Black History Month, Hispanic Heritage Month, and there's so much more to tell those stories from other people and their perspectives. And we're in the content business, so why not share all those perspectives? Wayne,
and just real quick
ahead.
on that, you mentioned sort of the different months. Like the thing I learned, sort of end of my time at Yahoo is like you don't need to be Black or you don't need to be Italian to sort of tell those stories. You just need to do your job as a reporter, right? You can report stories that don't directly impact you, because that's journalism. That's why you got into this business. So that was something that I think I came across in terms of reporters sort of being a little skittish about doing stories that were sort of deemed D&I because they were coming at it from a straight white male view. And I tried to tell them, like, look, like, A, you can tell these stories, and B, it's my job as an editor to sort of help guide you. So I don't think that that's an excuse, and I don't want people to sort of use that as an excuse if they're in a situation like that where they're asked to tell those stories.
And this is like very real newsroom talk. So for all the students, perspective of getting jobs soon, think about these words today that we're hearing, because it's very real questions that you could be asked about, story ideas that you could be asked about. Mario Murillo, our vice dean for the School of Comm, who's on here, he just put a question in the chat. Would love to know what you all think about the manner in which Colin Kaepernick was dealt with over the past 18 months. And after the George Floyd reawakening was happening in sports, and in particular football. Was he overlooked or sidelined again by the likes of ESPN, et cetera, even though he was ahead of the game, so to speak, sort of an Ali effect? So great question. I don't know if George or Marcus or Wayne, whoever wants to dive in, all three of you.
It may be an issue that Kaepernick was not given as much attention because you had the horrible graphic of a man's life being snuffed out on a city street. How do you allocate time and space for those two stories? Inevitably, people are last week's news, and I hate to say this, but Kaepernick is going to move to the back until something else comes along. But it's almost apples and bananas in that case, because somebody being killed is a little bit different from somebody being deprived of his work because of a political stand that he took. So I don't even know if you can compare the two, but George Floyd was very real, and I'm proud of the New York Times for as much as it's done. The New York Times has been, as far as I'm concerned, spot on race in the last few years, just right on top of things, going everywhere, spending a lot of money to get stories in there. And I just think it's a bigger story, what happened that day.
I think from what we saw in baseball, baseball has a reputation for being an older demographic, for being a wider demographic. And I think that it really opened the doors to, in terms of Kaepernick, players feeling comfortable with kneeling during the national anthem at a baseball game, which took years. It was years after Kaepernick did that for a baseball player to do that. But I think with the louder voices that Colin Kaepernick was able to really start moving with, that Major League Baseball players found it more of a comfort zone for them to be able to speak their minds as well, and for them to kneel during the national anthem, and for them to hear, make their voices heard as far as what was going on in race relations in 2020, and after George Floyd, and after Jacob Blake, and after everything that was happening last summer. It really changed the way I think that Major League Baseball dealt with a lot of this stuff. I mean, you see a Black Lives Matter sign at Fenway Park now. What a scene that is, just to see something like that in that ballpark, in that city, after what had been a lot of racial divide in Boston and amongst athletes in that town, and Chicago the same way. So I think that those conversations that Colin Kaepernick opened up allowed the baseball players to be a lot more comfortable speaking their minds when those things went down last summer.
And Marcus on that one?
Yeah, I think, the unfortunate thing about Kaepernick was because he was sort of ahead of the curve in all of this, that he never got his second chance in the NFL. And now, that conversation for a while, it would, you would see a quarterback get injured, or you would see a free agent quarterback get signed. The next question would be, why not Kaepernick? We're not seeing those conversations anymore in 2021. And I think because we are so far removed from when Kaepernick was an active quarterback, that it would be a stretch for any quarterback to spend that much time away from the sport to just, get back into the game. With that said, I do think that him not playing is more powerful. His impact was more powerful by not playing in the NFL than if he were to ever come back. And, if he comes back, he's not going to be, probably a starting quarterback. So what is the overall value in him coming back to be a backup compared to what he's been able to do off the field? So, I think if Kaepernick did what he did in 2020, he probably would not have been blackballed from the league. I think he would have still be, playing at the moment. But because it happened in 2016, when honestly we were just in a different, different society, different climate of how we approach these things, that he ultimately had to pay the sacrifice of his career.
Well, he did probably make a lot more money in endorsements and with Nike and with Netflix or whatever else than he would have playing football. And as a Bears fan, I can't imagine that the Bears, every quarterback they've had in the last 5 years was better than what Colin Kaepernick could have done until Justin Fields last night. But it was very strange to see all those quarterbacks come through the league and even through that one team and not see Colin Kaepernick get another chance.
Where are you guys all following media? Which writers are you reading? Podcasters are you listening to for your content? What are you consuming as sports journalism fans? Besides reading George Vesey's website, of course.
Yeah, that's a big one. I see all your numbers could jump into the thing. In fact, it would be fun to get somebody, under 107 writing into it. But I'm gonna be quick about this. I don't watch much. I don't read much. I read the New York Times page every day, so I'll learn so much. I subscribe to the Washington Post. I subscribe to Newsday. Washington Post has the best sports columnist in the country, and Sally Jenkins. Newsday has a great local section. I can find out what's happening with the Mets when I don't find it in the Times. I look for my friends at the Daily News. I have a friend who covers one of the teams there, and I look for her work. And the New York Post is an old-fashioned sports section. I look in on that a lot, and I find out where Rojas is going to be maybe coaching next year and so on. But I really don't read the things that, since Sports Illustrated went, changed in what it was. I don't do a whole lot more. I'm retired, and sue me, I just don't pay that much attention to it.
I will say,
with all due respect to what everybody else does, I'm just not there. I mean, I'm watching baseball. Wayne and Howie, the three guys on television. ESPN did a great job during the World Series. I could turn Fox off, watch the game, and turn those Fox guys off and listen to ESPN. If anybody knows anybody at ESPN, tell them they did a great job.
Marcus knows people.
Yeah, we're glad that you tune in, George. We appreciate that. But it's an interesting time as far as reading sports writing, because you kind of need a subscription everywhere. Like I wish you could pay per article. Like if I saw something interesting in the Boston Globe,
right,
I would just love to pay for that one article that one time and read that and not have to pay an entire subscription to the Boston Globe, because I don't need to read the Boston Globe for anything. I have a subscription to the New York Times. I have one to the Chicago Tribune. I have one to the Athletic. I have a lot of subscriptions, and I am paying into the sports writing or even just the journalism field in general. But I do think for young people that, that aren't making big salaries yet, or are still college kids that are struggling even to, make sure they eat dinner every day. It's probably a lot to think about having all these subscriptions to different places. And I wish at the very least you could just kind of pay per course and just go along with what you want to read, or maybe there's a certain article or a certain writer you like and can just follow that writer or those articles instead of paying these entire subscriptions to seemingly every, I have a subscription to Baseball Prospectus and Baseball Reference. So there's a lot, and they start to add up, kind of like with TV and getting Netflix and getting HBO Max and all this stuff. They all start to add up after a while.
Well, some newspapers, let's just start with newspapers, do have a limit of you can mooch in on 3 or 4 or 5 per month. So if there's something you really want, whether New York or anywhere else, but it is a good point, and that's why they put the paywall up there. I read this week that the New York Times is now up to 6 million circulation, and I guess another million in print circulation, but 6 million digital. They finally went over and hit 7 million total. And that's amazing for someone like me who came along and kept telling editors, this web stuff is a fad, it'll never work. And they had to say to me, stick with us, big guy, because this is where we're going. And of course, they were 100% right. The publisher was right. Arthur Sulzberger, he was saying we have color now and we're going to have digital, but they make you pay for it. And I think that's only right, because the money that's being spent to produce those stories, it would be nice to read them, but it's if you could pay by the story, that would be nice. But I don't think we're at that point right now.
What about you, Marcus?
Yeah, I mean, ESPN is also doing premium content as well. So there's a paywall. For example, NBA, the majority of our writers are behind paywall, and a lot of their content, all their content is, you have to subscribe to ESPN Plus, which also the advantage for ESPN Plus is you also get a lot of sort of video and live game service that you would not be getting from a New York Times subscription. So there's an advantage there. In terms of content I consume, I've noticed that in terms of my podcasts, I try to listen to less and less sports podcasts. I still will have like some standbys, like 20 Kornheiser, which is a sports podcast in theory, but it's if you know Kornheiser at all, it's rarely about sports. I will listen to some of the ESPN podcasts that our people are on, and otherwise I try to find stuff that is not sports to consume. On the sort of print side, I get a lot of my sort of stories via Twitter and sort of trying to see what's trending and what's what people are talking about and clicking through that way. Fortunate to have subscriptions to either through my personal account or just do work to the major outlets like the New York Times and The Athletic and Washington Post. So able to at least stay on top of that. But yeah, it's a good point about the paywall, and maybe one of the negatives behind sort of paywall in general, when you think about sort of blogging and aggregation, and maybe that's where some of the misinformation and maybe just some of the not getting the full story is when you have sort of stories behind paywalls and you have a blogger who's going in and trying to take out the sort of the media information and publish it for free. So that's a great point about just if you don't have the money and funds to access to straight journalism, then yeah, you're definitely behind.
Got a couple more questions. I know we're at the top of the hour, but there's some more direct messages that came in. One's from Dylan. He said, going along with Kaepernick's protests and the BLM movement, how would you expect to cover how do you think the Rick Monday baseball field moment in 1976 would be covered today if that happened? And for those that aren't aware, he saved the American flag from being burned on the field. I actually have a bobblehead somewhere back there that I got at a stadium giveaway. Amazing moment, but would it be covered today? Of course, but I don't know, George, you might have covered that for all we know.
Yeah, I was out of sports at that decade, but I think Rick Monday or anybody else who did that might still be regarded as having done the right thing in that context. Somebody on the field burning a flag, or maybe you'd let the police do it. I doubt that there are many athletes that would jump in and add matches to the thing just because it's somebody else's deal, because people have found better ways to express themselves. I turn on the soccer games from Europe now, and I see 22 players kneeling down before a match in, Germany or France or wherever it is, and the fans are racist. I mean, don't get me wrong, way worse than in the States, but the players themselves get it. They totally get it, and they're going down on a knee, and the sportsmanship that's involved with them. So I see that spreading, and that's Kaepernick. He did that. He had German guys and Italian guys kneeling for the general concept of equality, of fair play. Racial fair play.
Yeah, it's interesting now when players are on the field and somebody runs onto the field from the crowd. There's not much interest in the players' side to get that person out of there. It's not their job. They do have the security guards that run after them. So I wonder if a player, even seeing that, would involve himself. I think they would be taught at this point. And it was kind of different back then. Players didn't make as much money. They weren't as impactful to their franchises as they are now financially. And I would think that most players would be told to just stay out of the way and not involve themselves in the way that Rick Monday did.
I guess it's a judgment call. I mean, a player, if he saw something really heinous happening close to him that he could make a difference on, but it's hard to make that hypothetical call.
I will take the Center Pro approach. I feel like that incident today would be politicized, unfortunately. I think it would be a segment of the population. I think both sides could agree that what Rick Monday did was great, but I feel like it would just turn into something that it shouldn't be in terms of what the flag means. And I think, to be honest, the meaning of the American flag has changed a lot from 1976 to now. And I don't want to dive too deep into politics, but I think we understand, like, the last 5 years, like, the flag means a lot different to some people. So I think that would be the only difference. Would be it would turn into the second day and third day conversations would be a lot different than what it was in 1976.
Totally. No, that's why it's a great question from Dylan, because it's a political statement, story, different outcome, whether you're watching that story on Fox versus CNN versus ESPN. So, you never know. You might see something else like that one day that's similar, though. Jake, one of our graduate students, had a question. He was in the DMs. He was talking about Aaron Rodgers. I mean, that talk about, COVID and its reflection on the game and communication and potentially misinformation and lying and press conferences. I mean, it's a swirl of, you're not really sure what to believe, but then you start to see a lot of players, analysts that are former players, really speak out against Rodgers, and you go, oh, that's an interesting perspective. Not everyone's got this guy's back. How do you see that playing out right now in sports media, and how do you show that story in a objective way where you don't necessarily know what the facts are? And then the one interesting piece of it is, well, he may be allergic to something in the vaccine, which nobody has been able to prove or credit yet. But what do you from a storytelling perspective, how does that reflect?
I think he's really dirty on this one. He lied to his own people, not just the public, but to his own people in the business. And I don't think he can ever come back. Nobody's ever going to be nominating him for Sportsman of the Year when he lied all around it. He could have taken the idealistic, if you want to call it that, position, like, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to tell you why, and I'm not going to play. I'll take, you do the crime, you do the time, in a sense. Get out of there. If he doesn't want to get the shot, don't do it. But I think he has gone over the line and probably will pay. Even if he comes back to play quarterback, who would want him? Who would, football is always talking about the trust. Guy gets in a huddle of 11 players and he's breathing on them. Hey, Aaron, have you had a test yet? Well, maybe he has, but I think he's really disqualified himself. That's just me talking. But he's also can I get political on this? He's a symptom of his times. That he's not the only person who thinks this is a fraud or a joke.
Oh, he's not the only player in the league who's not vaccinated, and he's not the only quarterback who's not vaccinated.
Right.
And he might be the only one who lied about it publicly,
Exactly.
the way that he did, which is really what's gonna cost him in terms of his endorsements. And I think State Farm is, they probably have some issues with what he had to say. But yeah, as soon as he's healthy to play again for the Packers, he'll be back in that spot, and he won't be blackballed in the way that Colin Kaepernick was, or anything like that. I think Aaron will be fine, but it's a bad look certainly right now, especially with why he said he was immunized or whatever that even meant, and pretty much said he was vaccinated, and then it turns out he wasn't. I think and maybe the Packers players and maybe the front office knew that. But as far as what he told the public and now how it looks, it's certainly a rotten look for Aaron Rodgers, and I think it'll stain him for quite a while.
I think that's also a good lesson for the journalists in the room. If you go back to the press conference when it originally came up, and you hear his answer, he did not answer the question that was asked. So you should, in the future, if you find yourself in a situation where you're asking, a question directly and you're not getting the answer that you want, like follow up and say, no, Aaron, are you vaccinated? Yes or no? Because what he answered was, I'm immunized. That's not the question. The question was, are you vaccinated? So I think that was something that stood out to me as a journalist was, yes, he was being deceitful. Yes, he was kind of, essentially lying, but there could have been opportunity there to sort of put him on the hook in the spot at the moment to really get a true yes or no answer out of him in terms of, was he actually vaccinated?
That's a really good point, Marcus. And I'm not there these days since the pandemic. I haven't been anywhere near a ballpark or whatever. But it seems to me that the more I read and the more I see that any so-called press conference is much more a creature of the club and the league, that they're controlling it, and the reporters are getting pushed further back. You can't go into a clubhouse, where 10 or 20 reporters are standing around a player afterward and saying, well, what really happened out there and so on. You don't get close to them on any kind of personal level. It's all very stilted. So I think it'd be much harder to get the second question, is because that boom would have already pulled the microphone away. And that's one of the reasons why I think that a lot of what I read in sports writing today is removed by a degree. There's not the spontaneity that all of us who can remember what it was like to be in a clubhouse and get, nondescript, unknown players to tell you things that were important, or the stars themselves. Roger Maris I was there, 1961. I was covering him, watching his hair fall out, and you could talk to him after hitting his 56th, 57th home run. These days, it's all up with some fool from the club holding the microphone and pulling it away again.
Yeah, they've got to get us back in the clubhouses, even, from a broadcast standpoint, being able to tell the stories of the players. And we don't know these guys. The Mets had a lot of turnover over the past year as far as player. Francisco Lindor became a Met, and we don't know him. We can't talk about him in a way.
I think I know him.
With any sort of reverence. Yeah, but I mean the guys, James McCann. We should be able to tell stories about these players,
right?
And to not be able to have access to, there's like 7 or 8 guys on the team that we've even met. So it's really difficult for all of us to do our jobs without being around the players as much as we used to.
Yeah, that's brutal, because I know that as long as I covered, going back to my early Newsday days, we were in the clubhouse all the time, asking questions. They have to chase us out after an hour. And it was so much fun to get the player way in the corner and realizing that guy was telling you something that nobody else would. And Mets of '86, after all the people with the cameras had left, Keith Hernandez then would start talking, and he'd say, I don't know if you guys noticed this happened today in the 5th inning, and he was giving us a course. Now you don't get any of that because you can't get close to them.
George, how about the managers?
Sorry, go ahead.
How do I win?
The manager's office. That used to be where everything would happen. You talk to the man. I've been in the Mets manager's office at Citi Field maybe 3 times in 7 years. We're not allowed back there, so you're getting a far less perspective on even what the manager's thinking. I mean, he does his he does his interviews that he has to do before and after each game. But as far as the personal conversations and his real deep thoughts about what's going on, there's not much that you can really gain from not being around these guys or in their offices or just in their viewpoint the way they used to.
Yeah.
That's something to monitor. If you're graduating soon or getting into this industry soon, keep an eye on this, because it was already getting bad pre-COVID, and now that the leagues are hiding behind COVID as a reason to keep people out, keep an eye, because I think at some point this is going to come to a sort of a breaking point in terms of there are different writer unions within the sports that are pushing back on the leagues. But at some point, to do our jobs and really to do the team's service and the players' a service, they need to open up the clubhouses and let reporters back in. Yeah,
somehow or other. But I can see ball players using a reporter. I mean, they thought we were diseased before pandemic. What are they going to think now?
There's two more questions we'll go here. This one actually is from Alec in our graduate program as well. It's from Marcus specifically, but I'm sure the other guys can answer this too. Reporters like Jeff Passan, who you mentioned, and many in the NBA community are racing to break stories on Twitter so they can start the conversation and pull viewers to their website. Oftentimes they'll say story coming soon on ESPN or Yahoo. What are the challenges on the editor's side of things that many journalists and fans underestimate, and how can sports journalists help editors moving forward?
Great question. Yes. So the reason why you see journalists break news on Twitter like that is because they know that someone else is going to have that news if they don't get it out right away. Like, part of sports journalism now is you are a brand, essentially. You're an individual brand. Like, Adrian Wojnarowski is an individual brand. Like, Woj has turned into a thing. Like, Jeff Passan is a brand. He is known for breaking news. The challenge from a editorial side is you are giving away the news for free. And yes, you're probably, tossing yourself some paid juice because people are going to digest that news on social media and not actually read the full story. In a perfect world, the editors have a heads up in terms of, we have the story coming, we can sync, we can get this published immediately, and you can have the link ready to go. But the reality is, most times, the way it's so quick with the breaking news that they just need to get it out. And, that breaking that news story, what you might not get the page view, but you might get, you might see the crawl, Jeff Passan breaks so-and-so. And sort of as a consumer, as a sports fan, that might register. That might be more important than the one page view. It's just sort of like attaching the reporter to the name, to the news itself, and having that sort of brand loyalty and sort of news loyalty in terms of people that you should trust to break news. There are situations at Yahoo where, working with Passan, we could do some pre-writes and we could sort of have shelves ready to go. And if Passan knew we had enough time to sort of hit publish on the story, we could have a link ready to go. But then the other times too, where I was in the dark about stuff. So I would be informed based on Jeff Passan's tweets and not so much hearing from Jeff Passan, but that's because he's doing, 10,000 things in the moment. So it happens.
Another student had a question. I think we can keep this as the last question and we can end with some final words, but it's about John Gruden. And if you guys think the media handled this situation well, talk about, societal issues, and interesting story about emails that led to his firing, but forget the emails, and what he said was wrong and bad. So any commentary about that from a media perspective?
Yeah, it was one that I was just handed on a silver platter. Nothing to really dissect there when it came to what John Gruden wrote and said in those emails. It was as straightforward as it could be. From an ESPN standpoint, though, he was a longtime employee, so I could see where that would be a little difficult water to tread. But otherwise, it was pretty straightforward story of what he did and what needed to be done by the Raiders.
I always figured that a lot of football coaches felt like that. So I guess I wasn't surprised.
Sadly, nothing surprises me now when it comes to sort of racism in sports. I guess the two questions I had was who wanted John Gruden out, because it felt like if you're going through all those emails that there had to be an agenda, and why there was an agenda towards John Gruden. And then also, like, the NFL after that put out a thing basically saying, okay, we went through all the other emails and we verified that there's nothing else in there.
Mhm.
Are we going to believe the NFL? I'm not going to believe them. So I just wonder if there's someone actually going through the rest of these emails attached to the Washington football team investigation and ensuring that what the league said was true, because it feels like if you're the league, I couldn't trust them because they don't want another John Gruden situation. So that's where it comes down to journalists sort of doing the extra work to confirm themselves, like what's actually happening.
Any final words, any wisdom for the students on this genre within sport journalism and broadcasting?
Good luck. Good luck. I used to tell people in studying journalism to make sure you get another minor study. Of course, on a graduate level, you're specializing, and that's a good thing. But it's a tough business to get into. There are fewer outlets, and certainly on the print area, it's very hard to get in. And yet, my son is a witness how good the young people are at the New York Times, and they've been pulled in their 20s, and they're terrific. But do take some business courses and some language courses and be prepared to work out in the real world, because this is a very narrow specialty we have, and not everybody can be a sports commentator or writer.
Yeah, I do think that it takes a lot of persistence, and it takes a lot of perseverance, both in the job itself and to get the job. I also think it's important to, be willing to go other places. And, I know it's tougher for kids who grew up around big cities to go to a smaller town, but it sometimes is necessary to go to that small town and to learn how to write or broadcast or learn how to do the craft before you do get the bigger stage and the bigger eyes or ears on you. And have the opportunities in larger markets or national places like ESPN, because you want to be ready when you get there. And sometimes it takes moving to a town that might have 10,000 people in it to really have a chance to break through and get good.
I can tell you feel that way because you sometimes mention your minor league career, where you went. And my son, his first newspaper job was in Peoria, and he still talks with great reminiscence about these nasty old bastards on the sports desk who were picking on him, but also teaching him things. They're his gods now, because the way that they scared him into doing it the right way, and that's where you learn.
Yeah, I was in, I was lucky really, because I was in Mobile, Alabama, which is still a top 100 market at least. Yeah. And, I was there for 4 years, and then I was back in Chicago and then New York. So I kind of moved through more quickly, but, sometimes you can be in those towns for a while, and towns a lot smaller than Mobile. And you got to grind your way through it sometimes and really be willing to do that if you want to have that chance to get into a larger market later.
Right.
Just to follow up on that point, be flexible in general. Be flexible to location. Be flexible to the type of job you're applying for. Be flexible to location. All that, you need to just be open to everything, especially if you want to really break into this industry.
Marcus, do you mean including non-sports?
If it's in journalism, I mean, it took me 5 years after school to get into Yahoo, and that was coming. I had great internship experience. I interned at Sports Illustrated. I interned at ESPN. I worked for MLB.com. I didn't end up having a sports job out of school. I was fortunate to have a full-time job during my last year at Hofstra. I was very fortunate, but it wasn't sports. So don't be discouraged by if it takes longer than you expected. It took me, from my first ESPN internship in 2002, it took me 19 years to get to ESPN. And some of that was by choice. Some of that, I've had conversations with them and decided to do other things, but it takes time. So, don't be discouraged if you don't graduate and land at a major company right away. It's a business that is still very fulfilling. It's a business that you can still, there's always been the stereotype on journalism about money and not making any money. You can make money in this industry. It's just going to take time. It's going to take networking. Networking is super crucial. So please connect with me on LinkedIn. Use me as a resource. And just be open to other jobs. There's so many other jobs now within sports journalism that didn't exist when I graduated in 2008.
Like what?
It's just from the social media side, from all the jobs are now associated with the teams, which journalism, it's a gray area, definitely, but they are at least hiring young reporters that want to tell stories, and those stories might be funneled through the vision of the team, which is fine, but there are at least opportunities. They just might, what I hear so often from college kids, it's like, I want to graduate and become an NBA insider. I'm like, what does that even mean? Like, you see Stephen A. Smith on TV, but you don't realize Stephen A. Smith was a journalist. You see Kornheiser and Wilbon on TV, and you don't realize they were reporters and columnists before they even got to TV. So do your research when you're thinking about your future, and you see like the Skip Baylesses of the world, and you don't realize that Skip Bayless was a damn fine columnist. He put in his time to do what he's doing now. So, it's just going to take time for you to really sort of be where you want to be in terms of your career.
And Mario Murillo, you wanted to say something as well?
Yeah, I don't want to take too much time. I know it's a long night. I want to first thank Marcus and George and Wayne. I got in late because I was in a meeting with another group of graduate students in the public relations program, doing a strategic campaign to promote the Long Island Advocate, which is Hofstra's our school's local online news site, where I hope all of you will be contributing stories to. And I got on at 7:30, it's 8:30, so we're in prime time. And Chris, I might tip my hat off to you. This is better than anything you'll be watching on prime time right now. ESPN.
To be fair, Hofstra's playing right now. Hofstra's
Okay,
That's true. That's true.
Upset watch.
But I just want to say that I would love to do this again. This is an ongoing conversation because we didn't talk about sport. We were talking about our society. We're talking about our culture. We're talking about our politics. We're talking about our health, right? And I think that is the integral role that sports plays in all of us is why the school put so much weight on it and is excited about the program. And that's precisely because you can write and tell stories about so many components that in one way, shape, or form connects to the world of sports, right? It doesn't have to be the pennant race, although I'm still disappointed that the Giants lost and, that they didn't, beat the Dodgers and all of that. But besides that, it's not only about that. It's about what Marcus was talking about with George. I mean, I'm reading you for many, many years, and Wayne. This is the kind of stuff that our students are being nourished by, and I really appreciate you guys spending the time and doing this. And again, if we can do it again, maybe once a semester, I think it would be really useful to keep this conversation going. So I want to thank you guys for being a part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've been doing these. We did one on investigative journalism. We did one on the impact of radio reporting, and this is the first one we've done about sports and culture. But I think this is something we could do each semester because the stories are going to keep changing. I didn't expect to talk about Gruden or Aaron Rodgers, yet let alone a question about Rick Monday. So that was awesome. And for anybody that's not in our Hofstra family and in the graduate program already, people that join this call to see what we're all about, this is what we're all about. There are amazing alumni. There are amazing extensions and connections to our program that we have to be able to do things like this. And we have a specialization in sports and entertainment journalism as part of the graduate journalism program, where the coursework that you take, gets deep and, touches on the scholarship of how to tell stories on TV and radio and with the written word and on social media. And just because you're taking a sports journalism track doesn't mean you can't also take our investigative journalism classes, our community journalism classes. And we've really revamped the program the last 18 months we're almost at the record total of enrollees in the program. I'm anxiously awaiting 2 or 3 more headcount for the spring, so I could say I have the most ever in the history of the program. So please email me. I'll send you the in the chat here. I'll put my email for any students looking for more info on the program. And of course, if you want to get in touch with any of our panelists, also reach out to me and I can facilitate that introduction, because they're all great guys. I can't thank them enough. This was amazing conversation, things that I wasn't expecting to talk about based on just sending out a few different notes to them and say, hey, we'll see where it goes. But here we are an hour and a half later. So thanks, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and let's keep in touch.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.